This room should suit you.
Thank you.
Thank you?
I only wanted to ask, is there a fire? I've slept in far worse places.
The damp crept through the soles of her boots before the heavy door even clicked shut. He gave her the north tower, the room, with the shattered window and the crippled chair. He wanted her to break. Instead, she unpinned her hat, smiled at the dust, and asked for a match. The carriage ride had tasted of pennies and stale dust. Beatrix swallowed hard, trying to rid her mouth of the metallic tang of fear and travel sickness. Beside her, Adrian sat as rigid as a corpse. He smelled of cold leather, expensive pipe tobacco, and a deep, simmering resentment. They did not speak. They hadn't spoken since the magistrate muttered the final bindings of their contract 3 days prior. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt in the gravel courtyard of Oakhaven, the silence between them was thick enough to choke on. Adrian stepped out first. He did not offer his hand. Beatrix didn't expect him to. She gathered the heavy skirts of her only remaining wool gown, a dark, bruised plum color that had seen 3 winters, and climbed down unassisted. The stones beneath her thin-soled boots were slick with frost. Oakhaven was less a grand estate and more a fortress of decaying stone, hunched against the wind. It looked exactly how Adrian felt about this marriage. Hostile, cold, and entirely unyielding. "Follow me," he said. His voice was a low scrape of gravel. She followed. They bypassed the grand staircase with its sweeping mahogany banisters. They bypassed the east wing, where the air felt marginally warmer and smelled of beeswax and wood smoke. Instead, Adrian led her toward the servants' corridor, pushing open a heavy oak door that moaned on its iron hinges. The temperature plummeted the moment they crossed the threshold. Up the servants' stairs they went. The stone steps were worn down in the center, hollowed out by generations of hurried feet. Beatrix focused on the back of Adrian's neck. The harsh, erratic clipping of his hair, the tension pulling his shoulders up to his ears. He was a proud man forced to marry a woman holding his family's ruined debts. He hated her. It was a simple, uncomplicated fact, and honestly, Beatrix found it somewhat refreshing. Back in London, her creditors had smiled at her while quietly stripping her of her home, her furniture, and her dignity. Adrian, at least, had the decency to sneer. Up and up, 3rd floor, 4th, the air grew thin and bitter. Finally, he stopped before a narrow plank door at the very end of a lightless hallway. He shoved a heavy iron key into the lock, turned it with a sharp grinding noise, and pushed the door open. He stepped aside, a cruel, expectant tension tightening his jaw. Beatrix walked in. The room was vast, vaulted, and freezing. It faced north. A massive oak tree outside had violently relieved the room of its primary window pane during some past storm, leaving a jagged maw where the glass used to be. The wind hissed through it, carrying a faint mist of freezing rain that had stained the floorboards black with rot. There was a bed, stripped to a single, lumpy mattress ticking. There was a washstand with a cracked ceramic bowl, and in the center of the room, sitting askew on the uneven floor, was a high-backed wooden chair. It was missing its front left leg, propped precariously against a dented tin bucket to keep it upright. The air smelled of dead spiders, damp plaster, and years of absolute neglect. Adrian leaned against the doorframe. He crossed his arms over his chest. He was waiting. Beatrix stood in the center of the room. She could feel the icy draft sinking its teeth into her neck. She looked at the bed. She looked at the shattered window. She looked at the 3-legged chair. She knew what he wanted. He wanted her to gasp. He wanted her to demand a maid, to scream about her station as his new duchess, to cry, to hurl insults, to shatter against the stone of his cruelty, so he could feel justified in his hatred. He wanted her to prove she was the spoiled, manipulative extortionist he believed her to be. Beatrix felt a strange, hollow bubbling in her chest. It wasn't despair, it was exhaustion, a deep, bone-scraping exhaustion that made the miserable room look almost peaceful. There were no creditors here. There were no whispers from polite society. There were no desperate calculations of how many potatoes she could buy with a pawned silver spoon. There was just a room, a door that closed, a bed. She unpinned her hat. Her fingers were stiff with cold, fumbling slightly with the long steel pin. She set the hat gently on the cracked washstand. She ran a hand over the dust on the wood, feeling the gritty texture against her palm. Then, she turned to look at her husband. Adrian's eyes were narrowed, tracking her every movement, like a hawk waiting for a field mouse to bolt. Beatrix let out a long, slow breath. Her breath plumed white in the freezing air. She looked at the black, soot-stained cavern of the hearth against the far wall. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, quiet, stripped of any sarcasm. Adrian blinked. His arms dropped a fraction of an inch. "What?" I said, "Thank you." Beatrix walked over to the fireplace, ignoring the puddle of rainwater near the window. She crouched down, running a gloved finger over the cold iron grate. "Though, I must ask, is there a fire? Or at least, the means to make one? I am entirely out of matches, and the draft is rather sharp." Adrian stared at her. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, breaking only when the wind howled through the broken glass. His jaw worked, trying to find the trap in her words. There was none. Her face was infuriatingly calm. "I will send up wood," he gritted out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Much obliged," Beatrix murmured. She didn't look back at him. She was already inspecting the flue. Adrian turned on his heel and slammed the door shut behind him. The lock clicked into place. Beatrix flinched at the loud noise, her shoulders hiking up for a split second before she slowly let them drop. She was alone. She closed her eyes, sank onto the dusty floorboards, and let the sheer, overwhelming relief of being left alone wash over her. The wood arrived an hour later, carried by a scullery maid whose eyes were wide with terror and pity. The girl, a teenager, with flour dusting her apron and soot on her cheeks, dumped an armful of damp logs onto the hearth. "I brought a flint, Your Grace," the girl whispered, casting a nervous glance at the locked door as if Adrian might burst through it, and a bit of dry straw. "But the chimney ain't been swept in a decade." "It'll smoke. That's fine. Thank you. What is your name?" "Sophia. Mum." "Thank you, Sophia. You can leave it. I'll manage." Sophia hesitated, shifting her weight. I could fetch a blanket from the laundry. The master said no linens, but..." Beatrix looked up. The girl was shaking, terrified of being caught disobeying orders, yet offering kindness anyway. Beatrix's chest tightened with a sudden, painful ache. She had forgotten what unprompted kindness looked like. "No," Beatrix said firmly, forcing her voice to remain brisk. "Do not risk your position for me, Sophia. I have my heavy cloak. I will be perfectly fine. Go." The girl curtsied clumsily and fled, locking the door from the outside as she had been instructed. Beatrix turned her attention to the hearth. The damp wood smelled sharp and bitter, like wet earth and rotting leaves. Her hands were clumsy with the freezing cold. She tore a strip of cotton from the hem of her underskirt, the fabric ripping with a loud, satisfying sound in the empty room. Quote, she piled the dry straw, the cotton, and the smallest twigs she could find. It took 5 attempts with the flint. When the spark finally caught, the small flame licked greedily at the cotton. Beatrix leaned in, blowing gently, her knees bruised against the hard stone hearth. Sophia had been right. The chimney was choked with years of debris. The moment the larger logs began to smolder, a thick, acrid gray smoke billowed out into the room. It stung Beatrix's eyes, making them water profusely. She coughed, the sound harsh and rattling in her chest, but she didn't step back. She stayed on her knees, feeding the fire until it fought past the blockage, and a weak, flickering updraft carried the worst of the smoke away. The heat was pathetic, radiating barely a foot from the grate. Beatrix dragged the broken, three-legged chair closer to the fire. She wedged a sturdy piece of firewood under the missing leg. It wobbled, but it held. She sat down. She kept her heavy wool cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the thick collar pulled up over her ears. She stared at the flames, her eyes burning from the soot, her stomach cramping with hunger. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning. Yet, as the wind screamed through the shattered window, scattering rain across the far side of the room, Beatrix felt the corners of her mouth twitch. Then, a dry, raspy chuckle escaped her throat. The Duke of Norcliffe, a man of vast, terrifying wealth and influence. He had spent weeks in London glaring at her across crowded ballrooms, radiating a suffocating hatred because her late, gambling-addicted father had somehow ended up holding the deed to the Norcliffe hunting grounds in a drunken wager. Adrian had married her to get the land back, without dragging his family name through the mud of public litigation. He thought he was marrying a shark, a scheming, ambitious social climber. If he only knew she had spent the last 3 months sleeping on the floor of a rented boarding house, terrified the landlord would throw her into the street. This room, with its damp walls and broken glass, was a palace. The fire, weak and smoky, was a luxury. She slept in the chair. It was safer than the bare mattress, which smelled strongly of mildew. She curled into a tight ball, her head resting against the hard wooden wing of the chair back. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on her lungs, but her mind was blessedly, finally, quiet. Downstairs, Adrian did not sleep. He sat in his heavy leather armchair in the library, a snifter of untouched brandy resting on the table beside him. The fire in his grate was roaring, spitting sparks against the iron screen. The room was stiflingly hot. He kept looking at the ceiling. He waited for the thud of footsteps. He waited for the frantic ringing of the servant's bell. He waited for her to scream, to pound on the heavy oak door, to demand heat and food and respect. He waited for the mask of the stoic, calculating extortionist to slip. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning, 2. Nothing. The house was dead silent, save for the wind. By dawn, Adrian's resentment had curdled into a strange, gnawing anxiety. He had expected a fight. He had armed himself for a screaming match. The absolute silence from the North Tower felt like a strategic maneuver he couldn't parse. At 6 in the morning, he couldn't take it anymore. He strode up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. His boots hammered against the stone. He didn't bother with the key. He unlocked the door with a loud, aggressive snap and pushed it open. "If you have decided to play the martyr," Adrian started, his voice booming into the room. He stopped. The room was freezing, the air hazy with the faint smell of stale smoke. The fire had died down to a few glowing red embers. Beatrix was not dead of exposure, nor was she weeping on the floor. She was awake. She was sitting in the broken chair, which she had balanced perfectly on a split log. She held a small sewing kit where she had hidden it. He had no idea and was methodically restitching the torn hem of her skirt. She looked up at him. Her face was pale. Her lips possessed a slight bluish tint, and there was a smudge of black soot across her forehead. She looked rough, entirely unpolished, and intensely focused. "Good morning," she said, her voice slightly raspy from the smoke. She bit off the end of her thread and smoothed the heavy wool over her lap. Adrian stared at the log propping up the chair. He stared at the soot on her face. He felt a profound, deeply irritating sense of disorientation. "You didn't ring," he said. It sounded stupid the moment it left his mouth. "Was I supposed to?" Beatrix asked, genuinely curious. "I assumed the door was locked for a reason. Ringing seemed counterproductive. It is freezing in here." "It is," she agreed readily. "But the chimney draws decently once you get past the damp. I've had worse." Adrian stepped into the room. He felt out of place in his own home. "You have had worse than a room with a broken window in the dead of winter?" he mocked, though the venom lacked its usual sting. "Forgive me. I thought the daughter of Lord Stanton was accustomed to silk sheets and roasted goose." Beatrix's hands paused. She looked down at the needle resting in her palm. The metal was cold. When she looked back up at him, the flat, deadened exhaustion in her eyes made Adrian take an involuntary half-step back. "Lord Stanton," she said quietly, "died, owing 70,000 pounds. Silk sheets do not burn very long when you run out of coal, Your Grace. Now, if you are finished inspecting me, to ensure I haven't frozen to your floorboards, I would appreciate a cup of tea. If that is not included in our arrangement, I completely understand, but I would like to know so I may ration my saliva." Adrian opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in his 30 years of highly orchestrated, aristocratic life, he had absolutely nothing to say. He looked at the broken chair. He looked at the woman sitting in it, who had somehow taken his punishment and worn it like a comfortable old coat. He turned and walked out, leaving the door wide open behind him. 10 minutes later, Sophia returned. She carried a heavy silver tray that looked utterly absurd against the backdrop of the rotting floorboards. There was tea, real, black, Darjeeling, steaming fiercely from a porcelain spout. Beside it sat a plate, piled high with buttered toast, thick cuts of roasted mutton, and a small ceramic pot of plum jam. The smell hit Beatrix like a physical blow. Her stomach contracted so violently it sent a sharp cramp radiating up into her ribs. "The master sent this, Mum," Sophia said, her voice hushed, eyes darting to the open doorway. She set the tray on the cracked washstand. He said to leave the door unlocked. Beatrix stared at the food. The butter was melting into the porous, charred surface of the toast. She could smell the sharp, salty tang of the meat and the sweet, dark sugar of the jam. Her mouth flooded with saliva. "Thank you, Sophia," she managed to say. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of its previous armor. When the maid scurried away, Beatrix did not lunge for the tray. She wanted to. Her hands were trembling with the urge to tear into the bread like a starved dog. Instead, she forced herself to stand up slowly. She walked to the washstand. She poured the tea. The ceramic cup was scalding hot, and she wrapped her freezing bare hands around it, letting the heat sear her palms until it bordered on pain. She took a sip. It burned her throat, strong and bitter and magnificent. She ate the toast carefully, chewing each bite until it was practically liquid, knowing her shrunken stomach would violently reject the food if she rushed. The salt of the mutton stung the cracked corners of her lips. It was the best thing she had eaten in a year. Downstairs, Adrian paced the length of his study. The heavy Persian rug muffled his footsteps, but the rhythmic, agitated pacing was driving his hound, a massive, graying mastiff, into a state of nervous distress. The dog whined, resting its heavy chin on its paws. Adrian ignored the animal. He walked to the window, staring out at the driving rain. He was angry, a hot, prickly anger that lodged right behind his breastbone, but he wasn't angry at Beatrix. He was angry at the neat, convenient narrative he had constructed and how easily she had dismantled it by simply sitting in a broken chair. His solicitor had told him Lord Stanton's daughter was a viper. "She has the deed, Your Grace. She refuses to sell it back. She demands a union." That was what he had been told. It made sense. Stanton was a leech. It stood to reason his offspring would inherit his parasitic nature. Adrian had agreed to the marriage to protect his ancestral lands, fully intending to lock the extortionist away in the country and forget she existed. Silk sheets do not burn very long when you run out of coal. Adrian dragged a hand down his face, the rough stubble scratching his palm. The woman upstairs wasn't a mastermind. She was a survivor clinging to a piece of paper, because it was the only thing standing between her and the workhouse. And he had shoved her into a freezing room with a shattered window to punish her for a crime she likely didn't commit. He left the study. He didn't bother calling a servant. He walked down the corridor to the linen closets, pulling open the cedar doors. The smell of lavender and dried rosemary spilled out. He grabbed 3 thick woven wool blankets and a heavy down quilt. He slung them over his shoulder, turned, and marched back up the servants' stairs. Mas. When he reached the north tower, the door was still open. Beatrix was sitting on the floor by the hearth. The 3-legged chair had been abandoned. She was carefully feeding the fire with the remaining dry twigs. The silver tray on the washstand was entirely empty. Not a crumb of toast remained. She looked over her shoulder as his boots scraped against the threshold. She didn't flinch, but her spine stiffened. A subtle, defensive bracing that made Adrian's jaw clench in self-disgust. He walked in and dumped the blankets onto the bare mattress. The dust motes danced violently in the gray light. "The window," Adrian said abruptly, his voice too loud in the cavernous space. "I will have the carpenter board it up this afternoon, until the glass can be replaced." Beatrix slowly wiped soot from her hands onto her skirt. "That is very practical. I am moving you to the east wing," he added, the words feeling heavy and awkward on his tongue. "Tomorrow, when the rooms are aired out." Beatrix stopped. She looked at the heavy quilt on the bed, then up at Adrian. Her eyes were dark, bloodshot, and utterly guarded. "Why?" "Because you are freezing. I was freezing yesterday, Your Grace. The temperature has not changed. The Adrian crossed his arms, leaning back on his heels. He hated this. He hated the vulnerability of being wrong. "I was misinformed regarding your circumstances." Beatrix let out a short, breathy sound that might have been a laugh if it carried any humor. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on her arms. "My circumstances. You mean you realized I am not the architect of your misery, but merely a desperate woman who used her father's stolen chips to buy a roof over her head?" Adrian didn't answer. He stared at the jagged hole in the window. The rain was blowing in sideways now, pooling on the black floorboards. "Did you force the marriage?" he asked, finally. The question hung in the air, heavy with the smell of wet ash and lavender. "Your solicitor offered a buyout of £500, Beatrix said, her voice devoid of emotion, merely reciting facts. "The deed is worth 30,000. My father's debts were 70,000. £500 would have paid the butcher and the baker and left me to the debtor's prison, so I refused to sell. Your solicitor was the one who suggested the marriage. It tied the land back to your estate permanently, and it gave me legal protection from his creditors." She looked at him, her gaze piercing right through his heavy wool coat. "I did not want to marry you. I wanted to survive. You were just the largest life raft available." Adrian felt a strange cold settling in his chest. Truth, unvarnished, ugly, desperate truth. It was deeply refreshing. "The East Wing," he repeated, softer this time. "Tomorrow." Night fell, bringing a bitter frost that coated the remaining window panes in thick, fern-like patterns of ice. Beatrix lay on the mattress. The down quilt was heavy, pressing her into the lumpy ticking, trapping her body heat. For the first time in months, she was entirely warm. It felt strange. The warmth made her muscles unlock, releasing months of coiled tension in sharp, aching twinges. The door was shut, but unlocked. The fire had died down to a dull, pulsing, orange glow. She couldn't sleep. The silence of the house was too vast. In London, there was always noise drunks shouting in the alley, the rattle of carriage wheels, the relentless dripping of the boarding house plumbing. Here, the silence felt like a physical presence. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Beatrix didn't move. She listened as the heavy, deliberate footsteps stopped outside her door. There was a long pause. Then, the brass handle turned, slow and agonizingly loud in the quiet room. Adrian stood in the doorway. He was holding a heavy cast-iron bucket of coal and a kerosene lantern. He wore a loose linen shirt, the collar undone, and dark trousers. His hair was ruffled, entirely lacking its usual severe pomade. He looked tired. He didn't ask permission to enter. He walked straight to the hearth, set the lantern down, and knelt on the cold stone. He began to shovel the coal onto the dying embers. The harsh scraping of iron against iron filled the room. Beatrix sat up, pulling the thick quilt around her shoulders. "Wood burns too fast," Adrian muttered, keeping his back to her. "You would have woken up freezing in 3 hours." "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice thick with sleep. "The servants are asleep. I mean, you didn't have to care if I woke up freezing." Adrian stopped shoveling. He set the heavy iron scoop down on the hearth. He didn't turn around right away. He stared into the grate, watching the edges of the black coal begin to catch and glow, emitting a thick, acrid scent of sulfur that quickly warmed the freezing air. Slowly, he turned his head. The lantern light threw harsh shadows across his face, hollowing out his cheeks and highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. "I am a prideful man, Beatrix," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange in his mouth, rough around the edges. "I protect what is mine. My land, my name, my quiet." He ran a hand over his mouth, a gesture of profound exhaustion. "But I am not a monster. I do not freeze women in towers for the crime of being poor. You did, yesterday. Yesterday I thought you were a thief. And today?" Adrian stood up, wiping the coal dust from his hands onto a dark rag. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was swallowed by the heavy quilt, her hair a messy, unpinned tangle over her shoulders. She looked small, but the defiant set of her jaw remained entirely unbroken. "Today," he said, his voice dropping in volume, a low, gravelly sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Today, I think we have both been backed into a corner by men who gambled away our choices." He picked up the lantern. The shadows shifted wildly across the room. "The coal will last until morning," he said, stepping toward the door. He paused, his hand on the brass knob. He looked back at the broken chair, still propped up by the piece of firewood. "Don't sit in that damned thing again. If you break your neck, my solicitor will have a fit." Beatrix felt a sudden, unexpected tightness in her throat. It wasn't sadness. It was a bizarre, fragile spark of camaraderie. Two people trapped in a crumbling house, bound by a contract neither wanted, finally dropping their swords. "Good night, Adrian," she said softly. Adrian's grip on the doorknob tightened. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "Good night." He closed the door behind him. He didn't lock it. Beatrix lay back down. The coal popped in the grate, a steady, rhythmic sound that was slowly drowning out the howling of the wind outside. The air in the room was beginning to warm, smelling deeply of sulfur, old dust, and the sharp, lingering scent of Adrian's shaving soap. She closed her eyes. For the first time in a very long time, she slept without dreaming of falling. If this story of quiet defiance, raw survival, and the slow, messy thaw of two guarded hearts struck a chord with you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to support more deeply grounded storytelling. Share it with a friend who loves a slow burn historical drama, and subscribe to the channel for more original stories that skip the cliches and get right to the human truth. Turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter.